leaders of the Southeast Asian bloc, ASEAN, are holding their annual summit in the Malaysian capital of Kuala Lumpur. They are meeting for the first time since US President Donald Trump introduced his tariffs threatening global trade with disruption. Regional leaders are expected to forge a united front against this and other challenges. Now, tensions between Beijing and Washington remain high, and our next report is looking at how it's affecting the region.
Southeast Asia has been growing fast, both its economies and its influence. Following China's example, countries in the region have become key centers for global manufacturing and technology. But tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump in April have shaken confidence. They were later put on pause, but could kick in again in July for countries that haven't cut a deal with Washington by then. Some businesses are looking to move manufacturing out of China, which was hit with the hardest tariffs, into neighboring countries like Vietnam, accelerating a trend that was already underway. But if the higher tariffs come back, that will make things more difficult. Last month, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, doing deals to deepen economic and strategic partnerships, a way to counter the US tariff plan. China promoting itself as a steady hand as the US not only hits friendly countries with tariffs, but also pulls out of multilateral institutions. But there are long-simmering resentments and suspicions in Southeast Asia. One major problem is China's claim to almost all of the South China Sea. Vietnam and the Philippines, among other countries, also claim sovereignty there. China's navy has provoked confrontations with Filipino ships, encounters that could spiral into open hostilities. Despite those rising tensions, Beijing is trying to pull many Southeast Asian countries into its orbit by deepening its relationships in the region. The question is whether those countries can manage to keep out of the US-China trade conflict.
And I'm now joined by our correspondent, Melissa Chan, in Taipei. It's good to see you, Melissa. Just give us a sense of what the challenges are for ASEAN as the US-China relationship continues to remain deeply uncertain.
I think what was clear in that report is it's kind of caught in the middle between the United States and China. And one thing that is really important to keep in mind is how important this region is, of course, to China, to the point that if it was an entire bloc and if you calculated it that way, China's largest trading partner is actually ASEAN, not the United States, not the European Union. So in many ways, the relationship between China is one where, sometimes the raw materials go to China and Chinese factories produce that then manufacture and export to the United States and Europe. And then it also goes the other way where China is the provider of raw materials for manufacturing in the Southeast Asia region that then goes on to the United States and Europe. Either way, ASEAN is caught in the middle, which is why what we're seeing this week is particularly interesting because there is the ASEAN bilateral, so to speak, with China. But at the same time, the chair of ASEAN, Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, also extended an invitation to the United States to see if ASEAN as a bloc can speak to the Americans and negotiate with the Americans in regards to the tariffs. What this region is increasingly aware of and what the rest of the world is aware of is just how important it is. And we see that underscored, as you mentioned earlier, in the newscast with French President Emmanuel Macron in Vietnam and visiting a few other countries in the region. And I think moving forward, regardless of what happens in terms of US-China trade, there will be more attention paid to this region.
Yeah, and you were just mentioning the talks, the bloc's talks with the United States. What's the sense of how these negotiations will go? Will the bloc achieve its goal of negotiating together with the United States?
I think it's trying to do a lot of things together. I mean, one thing I should also point out is they're going to meet with the Gulf states this week. But in many ways, it is theoretically, it's an ambition of ASEAN to do things as a bloc. The reality is that these are different countries, as that report pointed out, with very different and diverse viewpoints in terms of how it wants to engage with both the United States and China. So on the one hand, you have the Prime Minister of Malaysia saying we need to negotiate as a bloc. On the other hand, his own country, Malaysia, is having bilateral trade negotiations with the United States, as is Indonesia, as is Vietnam, as is Thailand. So do you unite as a bloc or do you do things separately? And I think that's the tussle of ASEAN. I really want to underscore one thing. The best example of ASEAN's failures in many ways is Myanmar, right? This is trying to engage with Myanmar, trying to bring peace to the region, trying to stop the civil war, should be ASEAN's prerogative and its ability in terms of its testing of its ability as a bloc. And they haven't really been able to do that. In fact, the country with the biggest influence on Myanmar is China. So there you go. There is the aspiration and there's the reality that ASEAN has to face in terms of how it negotiates with various parties, including, of course, the United States.
Well, some fascinating dynamics in the region of ASEAN there. Thanks so much to our correspondent, Melissa Chan, for breaking all of that down for us in Taipei. Thank you, Melissa. Well, for more on this, we've invited Michael Vatikiotis onto the program. He's a senior advisor at the Geneva-based Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, and he joins me from Abu Dhabi. Welcome to the program. As you would know, Michael, ASEAN countries were among the hardest hit by Donald Trump's tariffs. They're now looking to present something of a united front in response to those measures. How do you see that working out?
Well, I think like everyone else in the world, the region is expecting a sort of a very unpredictable path towards resolving these trade issues. And I think what we've seen, the reaction of ASEAN, is to essentially start talking to other trading partners. We're seeing a special summit of the UAE and China. I think we're going to see more of this kind of unilateral activity to try and come up with trade deals that bypass the tariffs somehow. So I think that's going to be the future.
Yeah, and you talk about other players there. China is notably attending the summit. We know that Beijing's been making efforts to present itself as a more reliable partner than the current US administration. What is China offering, and do you see ASEAN countries taking that offer up?
Well, China's offering reliability and predictability. I think what China's doing by this second visit, because, President Xi Jinping was in Malaysia just in last month, and now Li Keqiang, the premier, is coming for this special summit with the UAE. I think that shows an extraordinary commitment by China to sort of play a closer, more cooperative role with its near neighbors.
Gulf countries have been invited to the meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about why they would have been?
Well, I think what's particularly interesting, and sitting where I'm sitting in the UAE, is the role of the UAE in some of these multilaterals now, because Dubai, Abu Dhabi, the whole of the Gulf, they see themselves as a very central part of the world in trading and logistics terms. And now that they're becoming a part of these multilaterals, there was in China yesterday, there was a UAE, India and China summit. And now, in KL today, this week, there'll be a UAE, China and ASEAN summit. I think that speaks to the way in which different parts of the world now are coming together to try and create new networks to better enhance trade. The problem is what happens when disputes arise. You still have to go through the WTO. The architecture of dispute settlement has not changed, whereas the architecture of trading is undergoing change.
Michael, you wrote a book called Political Change in Southeast Asia in the 90s, 1996 to be exact. What would you say is the main driver of political change today in the region compared to then?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question because 30 years ago, there was a tremendous amount of upheaval, protests that led to democratization at the end of the 1990s. And now you've seen, more or less 20 years of settled more or less settled political, stability, mostly sort of semi-democratic governments. And I think that's actually, now that the world is facing all these outside threats and uncertainty, I think Southeast Asia is well placed now because there's less political instability and there is more accountability in government. It's not perfect. I've called it semi-democracy or demi-democracy, but it's better than it was 30 years ago.
Well, thank you, Michael Vatikiotis, for sharing your insights with us today. We appreciate you coming on to DW.
Thank you.
And we're now joined by David Grunebaum. He's a journalist based in Manila. David, several ASEAN countries were badly affected by Trump's tariffs. They're looking to present a united front now. How do you see that working?
Well, these countries, they want to have a conversation with the Trump administration, and they want to avoid it from turning into a confrontation. That would not serve any of their purposes. I mean, you're talking about countries here that are, selling to the U.S. market things as high-tech as semiconductors, to household electronics such as televisions, to household appliances, to things as basic as shirts and sneakers and socks. And they need to keep these goods flowing to the U.S. because they are really, some of these countries are really export dependent. Their economies are dependent on exports, and the U.S. plays a big part in that. So they want to try to keep this going. And at the same time, they also want to engage some of the private sector businesses in the U.S. That are working within ASEAN to also have these conversations with the Trump administration. And while that's going on, you're still going to see some of these ASEAN countries having their own bilateral conversations with the Trump administration. That's really important for them as well. So you're going to see this happening on all those different fronts. But again, it gets down to what I was saying before. They needed to stay on a conversation, not let it turn into a confrontation.
Now, Beijing has been making efforts to present itself as a more reliable partner than the current US administration. What is China offering? And do you see the ASEAN countries taking up the offer?
Well, certainly from China's perspective, they bring up the argument that they are an ally, that they've been here for a long time, that they've been in Asia for a long time. They're a neighbor, not a Western country, a Western power that's constantly changing demands, constantly changing policies, constantly changing the dates of things. That's how China presents itself. For these countries, though, within ASEAN, what they clearly want to avoid having to choose sides between the two countries. They want to try and make sure that they can keep things working with both countries, and that certainly serves their purposes better if they can do that.
Now, the Gulf states are apparently also invited. Why is that?
For the ASEAN countries, they certainly want to de-risk here. And bringing in the Gulf states to do that, to open up potentially new markets for goods or expand markets where they have goods, that certainly helps benefit these ASEAN countries. And the Gulf states would be a natural place to try to do that with.
Now, which role does Myanmar play during this summit?
Well, when you talk about Myanmar, the big thing that's front and center is the civil war that's going on in this country. That's been going on for more than 4 years. That's displaced millions of people. Myanmar has just been an issue that ASEAN has not been able to deal with effectively so far. Now, ASEAN has the chair. The chair country rotates every year. The current chair is Malaysia. Anwar Ibrahim, the prime minister. He's certainly, been able to engage in talks. He had a meeting one-on-one with the leader, Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the junta. And then he also engaged in the conversations with leaders from the opposite side, from the national unity government. But the simple fact is this, that ASEAN has very little leverage at this point because these two sides are just so far apart. Having them in any sort of productive face-to-face meeting seems, like that's not going to happen anytime soon. But we have to keep in mind, this is a big problem for ASEAN, not only because of the civil war itself, which is obviously a huge crisis, but in addition to that, Myanmar, because of the crisis and the gaps in governance, there are sections of Myanmar that have just become hubs for transnational crime that include scam hubs, which include human trafficking. And a lot of the people, the victims who are being trafficked into this area, come from ASEAN countries. So ASEAN really desperately needs to deal with this, but they have no leverage right now, minimal leverage at this point.
David Grunebaum in Manila, thank you very much.
Sure thing.